The Mosin Negant rifle, ancient warhorse from the 1800s. That's what we're going to talk about today on Gunfighter Life. Really? On Gunfighter Life? Yes. Yes, that's what we're going to talk about. I thought that it would be cool to do a series on older, iconic firearms that are fairly common on the American market. I'm going to try it with the Mosin Negant, and then if it does well, God willing, maybe I'll do some more episodes like it on various rifles in the genre. But that's where we're going to start off today. Welcome to the podcast where we tackle this subject, and God willing, many more, the right way with Almighty God at the center, biblical, Judeo-Christian values, and real-world first-hand experience. Military, law enforcement, private security, contracting, lifelong shooter, been hunting since I was a boy, guide, firearms instructor. I've been blessed by God to do many things and live to tell about it, and here to help you guys. That said, I often say, like real-world first-hand experience. Like I've owned Mosin Negants, I've shot Mosin Negants. I'm a combat veteran. I did not go to combat with a Mosin Negant, right? I did not, bayonet any Nazis with a Mosin Negant. So when I talk about the Mosin Negant, it's because I've had them, I've owned them, I've shot them, and I'm familiar with ballistics and I'm familiar with firearms. So that's the first-hand knowledge we're talking about. That said, I am not a collector of historic firearms. This is not the episode to listen to if you're like, I want to find one in a pawn shop for $200 that has this different cartouche stamp and it's going to be worth millions of dollars. I'm not that guy. I will talk about some common variants on the American market. I will talk about its ballistic capabilities. I will talk about some of its history. It's an overview. I'm not the nerd that's like, it's got this stamp and it's from this arsenal, therefore it was probably in the Battle of N.R.A in the Russo-Japanese War. I'm not that guy. So just to put that out there. With that said, let's talk about a very cool rifle with a very cool and long history, the Mosin Negant rifle. This story begins prior, but the official, trial adoption, 1891. They were holding military trials in Russia, and I'm talking Imperial Russia, the Russian Empire, back when Russia had a king and queen before they slaughtered that family and put it in a bunch of nasty communists and had the revolutions, right? So old they had it, Russia had a king, right? That long ago, the 1891. Back when men still went into battle on large scale on horses. That's when we're talking about this. That is the era, right? Smokeless powder was just in its infancy. 1891. Russia was looking to modernize its infantry, its small arms, its go-to rifle. And the winner of those rifle trials was Mosin. Negant, I think, had maybe one feature from my research that made it into what we would now call a Mosin Negant. But in America, we call it a Mosin Negant rifle. I think in Russia, they officially called it like the 3-line, meaning like 30 caliber rifle or something. But I don't read or write Cyrillic, so let's go with the Mosin Negant. Adopted in 1891, a good bolt-action design, fairly modern for its time. And even for that time period, in the first several decades, I believe there were millions of these firearms made. Millions. They continued to be used. This is how modern it was for the time. They continued to be produced between 1891 and up past World War II. Think about that. Think about the world changing from 1891, riding around on cavalry horses, to jet aircraft, right? The Mosin Negant was still around and being produced. It is, how should I do this? Let's hold the cartridge talk for a little bit later. The Mosin Negant rifle is an internal magazine, meaning like it doesn't have detachable box magazines. You can either single feed it, like single load the rounds in there, or load them with a stripper clip. It has good iron sights. Originally, one of the coolest measurements, I think, as an old infantryman myself, is that the initial measurement of the Imperial Russians was Martians. And that was like a human pace, like a soldier's pace. You talk about grunt wisdom right there. That's a fantastic way for you to have sights marked out on an infantry rifle, infantry pace. Because how do you measure stuff when you're doing land navigation or range cards or things back in the day? Even in my day, how do we do that? Pace count. You pace counted it. Martians, genius. So some of the really old sights you'll see marked out in Martians, which is like a soldier's pace. Fantastic. But it has really good, very rugged, robust iron sights. I think they're metered out to like 1,000 Martians. Very long distance later, when they went to the dirty commie stuff, they would go to metric system, which came from the French Revolution, which in and of itself was an abomination. But anyway, it is a sad turning point for Russia and the world when they adopted the metric system, in my opinion. But let's leave that tragedy behind. It's still a good rifle. It's not the rifle's fault. Good usable iron sights. The rifles, just a general, you can get some very accurate ones, but just a general off-the-rack rifle, not super accurate, maybe 4 MOA, which by today is abominable standards, but by the standards of the day, when 1891 there were still people running around with, black powder, very accurate for the time. One of the very early, not the first, right? There were the French and there was 3 or 3 British, which predates it by, I think, 2 years. But very, very early on, Spitzer, like pointed bullets, what we consider a fairly modern cartridge, brass or steel cased, so a contained cartridge with a modern primer, modern smokeless propellants, and a pointed bullet. Really the last giant leap in firearms development as far as cartridges go. A very rugged, robust bolt-action system. Not unique to the time, fairly common of the era. It has a straight bolt, meaning not a straight pull bolt, but a straight bolt, meaning the bolt just comes straight out. The handle comes straight out of the bolt. It doesn't turn. Why? Because they weren't running optics then, so they didn't need it to be bent down like a lot of rifles that you'll see today. You'll see a turned down bolt handle. It's a fairly strong system, a bit complicated by today's standards, but a very rugged rifle, very rugged, robust rifle. It served in some of the nastiest conflicts and the nastiest conditions I would submit mankind has ever put their people through in war, in World War I and World War II on the Eastern Front, right, in the trenches, just horrible conditions. And they still produced it, so it worked. Now, it's of that era, right? It's of that era. I guess at the end, maybe we'll talk about how it stacks up to modern stuff, but it's a heavy, the rifle variant, very long, jokingly referred to as the tactical telephone pole, very long. You got to remember, these guys were fighting still in like Napoleonic warfare tactics. They were fighting in ranks. You might have a rank of 2 or 3 guys, like some guys loading, some guys kneeling, some guys reloading, and you would fire in volleys, right? And you would still do things like cavalry charges where you wanted a long gun with a long bayonet to spear things, like literally use these rifles as spears. That's how far back this rifle goes. They were super long for a reason. You wanted your muzzle to hang out past the guys in front of you that were kneeling down so you didn't shoot them in the face because you fired in ranks like Napoleon warfare style. Obviously, this would quickly evolve as far as warfare goes in the 20th century. But at the time, kind of par for the course to have a super long kind of pike for a rifle, right? So that's the era that it comes from. Heavy, old school, wood, steel. And as we'd see going forward with Russian, Soviet-developed firearms, crazy rugged as far as firearms go. Now let's talk about some common variants. You'll see not all of them, right? You don't be like, you forgot about that. This is not the exhaustive list of every Mosin Negant variant. That would be its own podcast, right? I could do a whole Mosin Negant podcast, start an entire spin-off podcast called the Negant podcast or something, or the Mosin podcast. But I'm not. I'm talking about common ones that you commonly see on the American market. If you have something else or you love something else, that's great. But common ones that you'll see are the referred to as the 9130. I assume that stands for 1930. I could be wrong. 9130. This is a real common, massively imported during the Cold War and the end of the Cold War. That's why I'm talking about these, because they're common on the American market. Certainly there were some war bringbacks. There were some in America. In fact, going back to history, America produced, back when we were on the same side with Russia, we produced many of these rifles, I think, prior to World War I for Russia. Remington and Westinghouse, yes, that Westinghouse, produced rifles for Russia. So there were definitely some of these in America going way back, and some war bringbacks, right, from World War I, World War II, Nam. But really these became prevalent on the American market at the fall of the Cold War, when the former Soviet Union satellite states needed money, and they sold a bunch of these, and they came heavy on the American market. That's where I know them from. They came on the American market as very, very, very cheap, almost absurdly cheap surplus for the quality of the rifle. I'm not saying they're the best rifle out there, but I'm saying for what they cost when they were dirt cheap, a very good buy. So they were massively flooded on the American market. The most common one, going back to this, 9130. The really long tactical telephone pole, heavy, a lot of times imported with a bunch of the accessories, bayonets, the cleaning kits, slings, the whole loadout, right? So the 9130, a very common variant. A much handier variant, the carbine, and carbine is like a term that you could apply to this because it's small compared to the rifle. The M44 carbine, there are other carbine variants, but the common one, commonly referred to as the 44 carbine, M44 carbine, this one is still heavy by modern rifle standards, but it's much more comparable to a regular rifle than the 9130. It's called the 44 carbine, but it's still pretty heavy, but it's much more manageable, much more akin to a modern rifle. These are real common on the American market, not as common as the 9130. That's by far the most common variant. There are some older ones. Again, there are some like older Remington ones and things like that. Those are highly collectible ones. The ones that are still kind of common and very, very good are the Finnish variants. There are a bunch of countries besides the Russians that used the Mosin Negant. The Finns captured a bunch of these, I think during the Winter War, maybe other conflicts, and they really, the Finns were really good with quality, and they rebarreled some, fixed some parts on some, put better sights on them. If you want just an original Mosin Negant that's probably a really good shooter and just more elegant, look for a Finnish variant. And there's a ton of Finnish variants. You have to look, again, I'm not going to go through all of them, but Finnish ones are kind of known in Mosin Negant circles as like the Cadillac of Mosins, right? I know that sounds crazy, but there are some nice ones. Another one that's, not real common, but commonly coveted, got tongue-tied there, is the sniper variant. Now, there are very few actual sniper variants on the American market. There are a lot of wannabe sniper variants, like somebody just slapped a scope on one and called it a sniper. I don't think that's even close. I don't know if this is what they did. And I'm not the greatest, collector of these, but it just stands to reason. If it were me and I was running a Tula arsenal, I would have shot a bunch of the Mosins in test firing and took the best, most accurate Mosins and then turned those into the sniper variant. I don't know if that's what they did. That's what I would have done if I was running a Tula arsenal, right? So the sniper variant is more than just slapping a scope on it. But and they probably picked reliable ones, like smooth operating ones that were accurate. That's what I would have done if I were equipping, designated marksmen and snipers, and I was in charge of the tool arsenal or the government procurement program. So I assume that's what they did. I don't know that. I'm just guessing. So don't take that as like for sure. I'm just guessing there. So the sniper variants were probably more than just a Mosin and Negant with a haphazard scope slap to it. But the sniper variants have some clout. They were not a bad service weapon for designated marksmen. And some of the most notable snipers in history, Vasily Zaitsev and Selmohaya. I'm not a Sami, so I might be mispronouncing that, but I'm certainly not Finnish. Finns are actually, side tangent, Finns are actually quite different as far as heredity goes and as far as genetics go from other Scandinavians, Norwegians, Swedes, the Viking peoples that I hail from. So Finns are very different language group, different genetics, all that stuff. So I don't know. But some very notable snipers throughout history have used the Mosin Negant. And not because it was a super accurate platform, because it's what they had. What makes a good soldier, what makes a good warrior, what makes a good sniper or designated marksman is not necessarily, is mostly not the firearm, it's the man. So put that in your back pocket. Contemplate that later. But the sniper variants are highly coveted, as are the Finnish variants. Now, let's get into the ammo, the cartridge, the 7.62 by 54R for rimmed. Back to those Kami measurements. I don't know what they called the cartridge because it predates the metric adoption. I don't know what they used to call the cartridge, but now it's commonly called the 760 by 54R. Not to be confused with the other real common cartridge, Russian cartridge on the American market, the 760 by 39, the AK variant SKS cartridge, right? That is a intermediate cartridge. This old warhorse is a full-powered rifle round. It's more akin to a 303 Brit or a 30-06. It's a full-powered rifle round. And one of the things that made these so appealing when I was coming up was not only were the rifles cheap, but you could get Spam cans, right? It looked like a giant Spam can or sardine can full of, I think it was 440 rounds. I could be wrong on that, but a giant amount of surplus ammo for dirt cheap. So that made the rifles really appealing. You could get a bolt-action rifle, full-powered, decent sights, and a ton of ammo for very affordable. So, again, that's why there's so many on the market today. And at the time, nobody really appreciated very few people appreciated the historic value of these. They got them because they were cheap. So a lot of people sporterized them and Bubba-ized them, redneckified them, however you want to say that, whatever vernacular you want to use. But the 7.62 by 54R was not just used by Russia, it was used by a ton of countries. There is a ton of different ammo out there. And I'm not the collector, but it ranges from like 147 grain up to the 180 grains. I'm sure there's lighter, I'm sure there's heavier, but that's the common weight range, similar to what you'd see in a 308, 30-06. Now, one notable difference is if you're a hand loader or a reloader, I say most, not all. I think some of the fins were a 308 diameter, but most of the Mosin Negants are going to be 312 or 311, 311 or 312. More like a 303 British than a 308 or 30-06. They're both 30 caliber, but they're a different diameter bullet. They're slightly larger. If you're just buying off-the-shelf ammo, you probably don't care, but if you're hand loading, it makes a difference, right? Most of that, all the cheap surplus stuff that I'm aware of is going to be full metal jacket. So it's good for, having fun at the range. Not good for a lot else. Certainly it's deadly, as both world wars would tell you, but it's not the best, right? It's certainly not great for hunting, not great for defense, not that you'd be using the Mosin Negant for defense nowadays, but you get the idea. Most of it's cheap surplus. Also, some of it is going to be corrosive, so that's very important. Not that you can't shoot it, not that, a Mosin Negant can't handle it. Obviously they can. There's still a bunch of them, around. But you have to clean a gun differently. And I'm not going to get into that, maybe for a tactical tip. But just be aware some of it can still be corrosive. Also, A lot of it can be steel cased and Berdan primed as opposed to boxer primed. You probably don't care about this unless you reload. And if you reload, you probably know what I'm talking about. But it is something to be aware of. One reason I'm doing this one first, if this becomes a series, is somebody asked a question about the 7.62x54R. And here's the rub. It's old. It's antiquated. A lot of the ammo is cheap surplus. It's got a rimmed case, right? It's an ancient design from 1891. That said, as far as ballistics go, it's comparable. I'm not saying it's just as good as, I'm not saying it's just as well thought out a case design as the 30-06, but it's older than the 30-06. So it's ancient. It's got a huge amount of taper to the body. It's got a long neck. It's not super efficient, right? It's got a massive rim on it. But, once the bullet leaves the barrel, once you get all past all that stuff, it's not as good as, but it's roughly equivalent to a 308, right? Or a 30-06 or a 303 British, right? It's in that ballpark. So ballistically, very capable, especially if you were going to get some good brass. And there are companies that make good brass for it. Good brass, good modern projectiles. It's very capable round. Again, it's antiquated. It's got a giant rim on it. It's not as good, not as efficient, well thought out, or high pressure as a 30-06, but it's within spitting distance of it. Okay. Now, where does this all stand for today, right? This is gunfighter life. This is not antique history collector life. Where does this stand for today? Again, I said when I was growing up, these were dirt cheap. I would, in fact, just buy them, buy them, shoot them, and then get rid of them, sell them, whatever, even if they were like the 44 carbine variant. Where does this stand today? They are nowhere near as cheap as they once were. They're not, racks of them for $79. So they're not as cheap as they once were. Unless there's some other Soviet satellite state out there somewhere that we don't know about with a giant stockpile, and we can actually import them. I don't see a bunch of new ones coming out on the market. There are still some that you can get coming in on the American market, but there's nowhere near the amount, which means what? The prices are high, as often happens with surplus, as happened with the M1 Garands, as happened with the M1 carbines, the SKSs. There was a time when they were dirt cheap and underappreciated. That day is no longer, right? And I don't think it's coming back. So they are not as cheap as they once were. I don't think they make sense unless you just want a Mosin Negant to go out and buy like a 9130 or an M44 carbine. If you just want a Mosin Negant, obviously, then get one. They are what they are. They're an 1800s designed, fairly antiquated, heavy bolt-action rifle. They're not as cheap. For what a decent one of those is going to cost today, you can get a very good modern bolt-action rifle. A Savage Axis, a Ruger American, likely, right? Now, there still can be some deals, right? If you find one that was sporterized, Bubba Eyes had like a Tapco stock put on it from the 90s, right? Looks like it fell through the tactical Tapco catalog and picked up a bunch of parts when it fell through. Those aren't going to be as highly coveted. So you might find one of those dirt cheap. And if you just want one, get it. I don't think they make sense financially to get one over a much more modern, accurate rifle in a common caliber. Again, there was a time when you could get really cheap 7.62x54R. Those days aren't around. I just checked prices on them. They're in the ballpark of 308, 30-06, certainly more expensive than 223. So doesn't make a lot of financial sense to get one, again, unless you just want one. They're still a very capable rifle. To put it in terms that you might understand if you have gotten into guns in the past decade or so, the gun tube glitterati was pushing 45-70 lever guns, which is way older than this by design and as far as usefulness, right? Way older. Not that you can't still kill stuff with a 45-70. You absolutely can. And if you want to play John Wayne and look cool, you go for it, Pilgrim. But in terms you can understand, if you told me that you were going to exempt me, you were going to give me amnesty from all fish and game laws, and you were going to drop me off in the river of no return, Frank Church Wilderness, or somewhere in Alaska, and I could just live off the land freely, and you were going to give me one center fire rifle, and I could pick between a good one that I ran and got to shoot, make sure it shot well, Mosin Negant, or a lever action 45-70, I'm picking the Mosin Negant. Right? It's a better all-around gun. If you let me handle my own ammunition or get good, and there are some very good hunting loads and good, well-performing ballistic rounds for this, I wouldn't take full metal jackets. But I would take the Mosin Negant over the 45-70 lever gun all day long. 45-70 lever gun is way before the era of this, where you're talking about modern pointed bullets and high-velocity rounds. And as romantic and cool guy and all the gun tube glitterati pushing 45-70 lever guns is, I think if you were going to actually go live off the land, Mosin Negant 760x54R is a more practical choice. To put it in perspective. So if you look at it like that and look at what a 45-70 lever gun costs, $1,200, $1,300, as far as practically goes, Mosin Negants are still a good buy. They're still a rugged, robust bolt-action rifle. Some things that just to be aware of in my experience from shooting them. Many of them are not zeroed. Even though they've been around a long time, you would assume they're zeroed. They're largely way off. So you're going to need to zero iron sights if you don't know how to do that, if you're going to get into Mosin. So be aware of that. Also, be aware that some of them, if you want to shoot high volume, they can get really sticky in the bolt. Like the bolts get heated up, and the actions can be pretty sticky. It's a gun you got to manhandle. You got to run that thing like you mean it, like you're trying to break it, if you want it to actually work. So be aware of that. Also be aware, since a lot of that ammunition was corrosive and these may have not been taken care of the best, keep an eye out for the bore. Keep an eye out for the bolt. If you see a bunch of really deep pitting and corrosion, that's a key that they weren't cleaned properly. So that's something to be aware of in my experience with the Mosin Negants. Also, be aware, if you look at the muzzle, some of them could have been not re-barreled, but re-crowned, like they did some counter boring, and there's probably a better term for that, but they bored out the front of the muzzle to cut back down into the rifling because it was all, chewed up or eroded or whatever. So that's something to be aware of. You might want to steer clear of those. If you were just looking for a shooter, or if I was just looking for a shooter at this point, since they've climbed quite a bit up in value, look for one with one of those polymer Tapco stocks, that's still functional, that's still reliable, and buy one, shoot it, see if it's a shooter. If it's a good shooter, reliable, fairly accurate for the standards of a Mosin Negant, right, good rifle. All right, with that, how about the tactical tip of the day? I said I'd maybe come back to it. Corrosive ammo is a standard for a long time. Why? Because it stores really well. It lasts a long time. But it can be corrosive, as the name implies. A good way to clean many weapons, but especially these older military weapons, hot soapy water. Hot soapy water does well. Use hot soapy water, let it dry. After that, run some oil on it, some ballistol, something like that. But hot soapy water can be really good for cleaning out corrosive stuff, corrosive ammo. No, water's not going to kill. If water killed these weapons, they'd have been dead a long time ago, right? So just let them dry after you wash them. So there's a good tactical tip there. Very cheap, very effective. And it's going to be much better to run hot soapy water in them after you've shot corrosive ammo than just not running hot soapy water and leaving the corrosive salts and stuff in there. So there's that. Another real common one when these were, corrosive ammo was still fairly common, Windex. Why? Because Windex has ammonia. It's largely water and a little bit of ammonia. That said, if you do clean some of the corrosive stuff out with Windex, I would still use something else after that, some kind of more modern, ballistol or CLP or something. But that is a thing that was commonly used, middle of the, when these were common on the market and when corrosive ammo was still fairly common. It's a lot less common today. Your tactical verse of the day. I mentioned the word pilgrim. It's got me thinking about a verse. For they declared plainly that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. My comments on that verse. It's a great verse to remember that our time here on this earth, as we are today, as we exist today, is temporary. God willing, you and I will spend time with God in eternity. But as far as like our physical existence on this earth as we are now, it's temporary. It's we're camping out, right? It's a temporary situation. We're strangers and pilgrims on the earth. With that, thanks for listening and have a blessed day.